Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
8 years after winning her first Pulitzer Prize for drama, playwright Lynn Nottage is celebrating her second for a work that couldn't be more timely. Sweat explores the economic and societal pressures facing working-class America.
Nobody ever tells you that no matter how hard you work, there'll never be enough money to rest. It's fact.
Set in Reading, Pennsylvania, where factories are shipping jobs overseas and local residents are turning on each other to preserve what's left of their American dream. The drama explores both the issues and the feelings that helped propel Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency. It's been called the first theatrical landmark of the Trump era. Nottage won her first Pulitzer for the play Ruined, which focused on women surviving civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But despite critical acclaim for that and her other works, it's taken 8 years for this woman of color to finally get the chance to stage a production on Broadway. Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, Lynn Nottage tells us about her journey in what President Trump used to call the Forgotten America. Ms. Nottage, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Congratulations on winning your second Pulitzer Prize for drama.
Thanks.
Does
Yes.
it feel different this time?
Well, it does feel a little bit different. I'm older, and I feel like I'm really in a place in my life where I can feel sort of the weight of winning such a thing, particularly as a woman and a woman of color.
You've said, in fact, with this award, number one, I'm representing for women. Number two, I'm representing for playwrights of color. Is there one that's more important to you? Which one takes?
I think that I'm both. I move through this world, and I don't really sort of divvy up, who I'm entering the room as first. I enter as Lynn, who's this woman, African-American woman.
Bring it all to the table.
Yes, I bring it all. You get all of me, for better or for worse.
So your play Sweat was written before the last election, and yet it really captures the mood of working class America, those old industrial cities where the jobs have gone, the factories have packed up, the very people who voted for President Trump. And so many prognosticators thought he would never win the election. I'm wondering, did you see it coming?
I must say I was as surprised as anyone else that Trump won. I would never anticipate that we'd sort of swing that far to the extreme. But what I did recognize, and it's certainly what I wrote in Sweat, is that people were in pain, and people felt invisible, and people felt frustrated, and really wanted some sort of shift philosophically. I didn't know that the philosophy would lean toward Trump.
What was your reaction to him winning?
I was in shock. I remember just after he won, I was lying in bed with my husband, and we each got a quart of ice cream, and we consumed it, which was really unusual and felt terrible afterwards. But I felt like it was a punch to the stomach. I really felt like what America was saying is that it didn't recognize me in my totality, and I felt hurt by it.
So the play is set in Reading, Pennsylvania. And I've read that you were intrigued by the story of Occupy Wall Street, the 99%, and their frustrations with the 1% who have so much wealth. Is that what led you to Reading?
Well, I think my journey to Reading began a little before then. It began with an email that I received from one of my closest friends who was a single mother of two who lived 2 doors down from me, and she wrote an email late one night just saying that she was in trouble, that she had been broke for a number of months, and she couldn't tell anyone, and the smile that we saw on a day-to-day basis was really masking her despair. And she wasn't asking us for anything specific, but she felt like she needed to unburden. And that really made me sad and made me really think about, on a regular basis, we live maybe 2 doors or 3 doors down from someone who's experiencing some form of economic insecurity. And that's what sent me to Occupy Wall Street, which was beginning that very same week. And so I felt very much part of that movement, and part of the 99% was saying, hey, we're here and we really need to be heard.
So Reading was once home to the Reading Railroad, factories, textile mills, but they've lost more than just jobs, right? And we hear Tracy in one of the scenes talking about what it used to be like going downtown. What goes with those jobs?
You know, I think that for so many Americans, particularly Americans who lived in the Rust Belt and some of these industrial powerhouse cities, that work was really tied to identity. And so when you lose the work, you really lose a sense of who you are. And I think that that's what's happening in America on a larger scale, is that you have a large swath, in particular of white Americans, who've really been identified with what they did. And when that's removed, I think folks begin grappling with, what is our narrative now? Who are we? And when I was interviewing people in Reading, one of the things that I was really struck by is that people always said Reading was. They always spoke of Reading in the past tense. And I find it fascinating that a culture that can't really see itself in present tense or future tense tells you something about how we perceive who we are.
And what we really see in the play is how different communities end up against each other, communities that start as friends, and these tensions arise. Another scene that really struck me is when Jason makes the comment about Black History Month. He makes a disparaging comment about Black History Month, and then he says, "Why isn't there White History Month?" And it gets a laugh from the crowd, especially when Chris says, I'm gonna let you think about that for a minute. But I heard during the election a lot of comments like that, people saying on the right that, you know, identity politics is what's wrong with America, this hurt over, you know, a lack of pride in white America.
Well, and listen, here's the deal, and this is how I feel about this topic, is that for a really long time, white privilege has been seen as a superpower. And really, diversity is the kryptonite. Is that white folks thought as long as they're white, they can sort of really, in some ways, dismiss or look down on those of us who are really part of the fabric of this culture. But I think that there's been a paradigm shift, because suddenly you have a very insurgent and robust economy that's built on people of color, and we're growing in this nation. I think that by 2050, that this country will probably be a majority minority country, and I think that that's really sort of scary to a lot of folks. And what I call is like white panic, is that there's this panic that the culture is going to change so much and that they're going to lose their identity, rather than sort of embracing that it's a shifting identity, it's evolution, is that we're constantly, in order to move forward, we have to adapt and change. And I think that that's part of what's been beautiful about America, but I think that's also part of what this white working class that voted for Trump is reacting to.
And you spent 2.5 years in Reading, back and forth, researching.
Yeah.
How were you, as a big city African-American woman, received there?
Reading is a small city, and it's interesting because it's really not that different demographically than New York and the communities that I grew up in. It's predominantly Latino. I grew up in a predominantly Latino community, so there are things and aspects of it that felt very familiar to me, and I felt comfortable going in that city. Though often I was perceived as an outsider, which I thought was interesting. But I thought being an outsider allowed me a certain level of distance and allowed me to ask questions that I think people who are living in the city don't necessarily ask themselves on a regular basis.
And how was it interacting with the white working class in particular, though?
Well, it's surprising, because I thought that there would be some resistance, but I think so few people actually ask them questions, and ask them questions about, like, how are you feeling and what are you experiencing, that I found that people really sort of leaned in and responded with a level of honesty that surprised me and that I hadn't anticipated.
And you're still going back to Reading
I am.
on a regular basis. Can you tell me about the art installation that you're working on?
Sure. When I went to Reading initially, my assumption that I would be there for a couple of days and I wouldn't stay very long. And I happened to find stories that inspired Sweat, and got to know a lot of people and forged a lot of really close relationships, and really became invested in the life of the city. And I felt it wasn't enough to sort of poach it for a story and then leave. I felt like I want to build something that I can leave here that really gives people a sense of civic pride, something that's reflective of the community, something that invites this very fractured community into into the belly and forces people to have conversations that they're not having on a regular basis. I also want to create something that was beautiful, because repeatedly I'd ask people, like, if you could enter into an art space in Reading, what do you want it to look like? And they said, we just want something that's going to surprise us, something that's going to be beautiful. And so I've heard that, and that's hopefully what we're going to create in downtown Reading, in the former Franklin Street Reading Railroad Station. If you know Reading Railroad on the Monopoly board,
right.
This is one of the stations in Reading.
Was there a particular story that stuck with you and really inspired you when you were writing this play, of the people that you met there?
There were lots of stories that stuck with me. I mean, the one in particular, and it was the inspiration for the play, was when I sat down with a group of steel workers who, by and large, were middle-class white men who'd worked in this one metal tubing factory between 25 and 30 years and had arrived at their factory one day, and half of the machines were gone. And they were told that they would have to take concessions in order to continue to work. And this really surprised them, because they had invested, in some cases, multiple generations in that factory. And those stories just moved me in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And I found myself very empathetic and listening to folks who I wouldn't necessarily sit down with on a regular basis. And so that really inspired the play.
What has the reaction been from the people that you were speaking with, and what do you hope the people of Reading take away from this play? They're probably not the typical people who come to Broadway to see a play, right?
No, they aren't. And in fact, a lot of the people who I interviewed and spoke with have seen the play. They saw the play in Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where it originated at Arena Stage at the Public, and even here and on Broadway. But we had the opportunity after the Public Theater production to sort of shut down shop and take the entire production to Reading for one performance. And it was really stripped down. It was a bare bone production, but all of the other elements were there. And we played it to about 500 people, and the response was tremendous. I was scared, the actors were scared. We had no idea how it was going to be received. And I think they were more nervous doing the play in front of that Reading audience than on opening night on Broadway, but people responded in such a tremendous and such a generous way. At the very end, we did a Q&A, and people asked us a few questions, but by and large, people just wanted to testify. They wanted to share their stories, and what we found is that their stories really paralleled a lot of what was happening in the play, and most of the people had either experienced what the characters in the play experienced, or they had friends or relatives who had experienced that.
So Sweat does highlight these divisions in our country, this polarization, but it ends on a note of hope.
Yes.
Do you have hope in the age of President Trump that we can come together? You
know, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think sometimes when we are in the midst of a turmoil or a moment like this, I think that we can lean into the pessimism, but I think that sometimes it pulls us together, and I think that we may find interesting alliances that are forged because of what's happening right now, and that's what I look to. You know, I just don't want to sort of give in to the malaise and become complacent.
So Sweat earned you your second Pulitzer. The first was for Ruined, a story that was set in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not a place that most Americans know much about. I'm wondering if your time working as a human rights activist for Amnesty International led you in that direction.
Yeah, I think that Amnesty International, which was, I worked there for 4 years just after I graduated from graduate school, and I really think in many ways that was my second graduate school, and really the foundation of who I am as a writer and as a human being. I think that it really made me listen to what's happening in the world in a way that I hadn't prior to that, and I think that that infuses everything that I write and everything that I do.
Why did you focus on women, given the many issues in the DRC that could have come up, post-colonialism, tribalism?
Oh, I can tell you very specifically, when I was reading the newspaper, and I can't even say headlines, because when I first began engaging with the Democratic Republic of Congo, usually the articles were like on the back page or, you know, toward the back of the newspaper. And what I found is that there was an absence of any news about what was happening to women and children. And as you know, in wars, 50% of the people who are impacted are women or children. And yet, very rarely do we understand what's happening to them.
The characters that you wrote about were based on your interviews with real refugees who had escaped armed conflict. So much discussion about refugees in the world now is so negative. Just wonder your reaction to that.
Well, I think that you look at sort of at least the history of America, and it's the history of people sort of fleeing either economic circumstances or fleeing wars. And I think that it's really important for us to continue to embrace folks who need refuge. I mean, that's how I feel. I feel like we are better when we sort of accept rather than rejecting.
I know you traveled a lot for research for that story. What was that like? Was it difficult to gain people's trust there as an American woman?
I found like going into the refugee camps, I had a very similar experience that I had going into Reading, Pennsylvania, is that people, by and large, felt very invisible, very unheard. And so when someone sat down, and it always began when I was interviewing people in Uganda, or whether it was in Kenya, or whether it was in Reading, Pennsylvania, by saying, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not someone who can really change your circumstances, but what I can do is I can sit and listen, and I can listen to your story from beginning to end, and I can offer empathy. And I found when I said that people really kind of relaxed and told their stories, and in many instances, they were telling their story uncensored for the first time.
And the main character is Mama Nadi, a woman who runs a brothel and a business. Not your typical hero. Why did you center on her?
Well, I'm really interested, and I think it's true for Ruined, and I think it's true for Sweat, in the things that people do when they're in really sort of extreme circumstances in order to survive. And I think it's true of all of us when pressed up against the wall, is that sometimes we make these very compromised decisions. And I think that it's certainly something that's happened in America, is that people feel panicked, and so they end up making really sort of bad decisions about who should lead. And so I'm interested in that cognitive dissonance and that complexity.
Kate Wariski, the director for Sweat, was also the director for Ruined, and she traveled with you a lot to Africa. That's unusual for a director to be so involved, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I think that we've had a really wonderful collaborative experience, and in many ways, I think it's useful to travel and with someone who you're going to work with, because she came away with a lot of information that I could never have imparted if we sat down and spoke. I mean, she saw the colors of the landscape, and she spoke to people, and she heard the tone of voice when people were sort of conjuring their experiences, and I don't think that I could have replicated that. And I think that one of the successes of our collaboration is that we've encountered the same material and had a visceral response, and so that infuses what we do.
Were you surprised Ruined never made it to Broadway, given the many accolades it received?
You know, it's like yes and no is my answer to that. It's like, am I surprised that it didn't make it to Broadway? No. Was I disappointed? Yes.
What did people tell you?
I was repeatedly told is that we didn't have a big enough star to open it on Broadway. And I said, well, we can find a star. And then I was told there isn't a big enough African-American woman star to open it on Broadway. And so every time I offered an option, I was told that it wasn't a possibility.
Do you think that's changing?
I think number one, it was untrue back then, and I do think it's beginning to evolve a little bit. But I do still feel that resistance. I mean, the fact is, in this Broadway season, there are only 2 plays that are written by women, and I think I'm the only playwright of color who's alive who has a play represented this season. So I think that tells you something about the landscape that we're still living in.
As you say, there's so few women per season on Broadway. Are men's plays better? Is that what this is all about? Is the culture really keeping you out?
I think no, men's plays are not better. As a professor, I can attest to the fact that I see so much incredible writing by women that I feel once they get out of the universities ends up getting neglected. What is keeping us out? I think, there is still that glass ceiling. There's still the illusion that that somehow what a man has to say is more important, which, as we know, is not true. And I think that we as women have to begin to support women's plays with our dollars, and 75% of the tickets are still bought by women. And so I think that we have real power to change what we see.
But now here you are. You're on Broadway with Sweat. You've described what it's like seeing your name up on that marquee, or the name of Sweat up on the marquee. Absolutely magical, I think, was the way you described it.
It is magical.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I have to say, it is a dream to have a play on Broadway. It's like I've been doing this for a very, very long time, and this really does represent sort of the pinnacle of a playwright's career, is to finally get to a space where you can have a very large audience.
Were you tempted after Ruin to go in a more commercial route to get to Broadway? One off-Broadway theater director that staged one of your plays described you as a dangerous writer for taking on such political topics.
Yeah, you know, I will say honestly that Broadway has never really been my endgame. I think my endgame is to explore subjects that I think are interesting and to write characters that I felt have never been put on the stage before, or write them in such a way that's really sort of fresh and forces people to shift their perspectives. And I thought, if I get to Broadway, great, but if I don't, I'm okay as long as there's an audience that's willing to engage with my work.
So tell me about your upbringing in Brooklyn, the daughter of a social worker and a public school teacher. I've read you had a lot of artists in your home, many women telling stories. That must have had a big impact on your life.
Sure. I mean, I feel very blessed to have grown up in the community that I grew up in, which was downtown Brooklyn, which at the time was somewhat of a rough neighborhood, but it was very multicultural as a result. I described the neighborhood, it was a neighborhood between neighborhoods. It was a neighborhood that everyone passed through to get to where they lived, but as a result, I think that it attracted people who were outsiders from every place else. And so we had a community of outsiders that really took good care of each other. And my parents were people who really were very deeply invested in the success of their children. I was describing to someone that my mother, when I was growing up, and I grew up in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when I came of age, when there wasn't a lot of African-American women represented in magazines or on television or in the media at all, or even in storybooks. And I remember my mother would meticulously use a brown magic marker to color in all of my coloring books. And I just imagine her sitting late at night while I was in bed doing that, because she wanted me to see myself represented. And I think that's just indicative of the home that I grew up in, is that there was such care to protect who I am and to make me feel empowered.
You've taught and are teaching at some of the most prestigious universities in the country. I'm wondering, are young people as interested in theater as they once were in this digital age?
I think so. I think you just have to look to the number of MFA programs that exist right now versus how many there were 10 years ago. And I think that people still gravitate toward theater. I think that even in this digital age, there's a real hunger to sit in a space and experience art communally. I think that people respond to the kind of dynamic way in which storytelling can shift based upon the energy in that room. And I think that with digital media and with television, you can't have that. And so I think that we will always be addicted to that feeling. And also, I think that a lot of television shows really want playwrights because we know how to tell stories.
And where are you going to take us next? What's your next project?
Well, I'm working on I won't call it a sequel, but I'm working on another play set in Reading that sort of touches upon some of the characters that are in Sweat. And it's going to be infused with much more humor because I think we're now in a moment in which we kind of need to laugh to keep from crying. I think that's my next big project, but I'm working on some musical theater projects. I've been working for a long time on an adaptation of my play Intimate Apparel to turn it into an opera, which was commissioned by Lincoln Center and the Met with composer Ricky Ian Gordon, and I've listened to it, and he's done magnificent work, so I'm hoping to continue to work on that. And I have a couple of other musicals. I'm doing an adaptation of Black Orpheus, the film that was made in the late 50s with director George Wolfe, and an adaptation of the book The Secret Life of Bees with Duncan Sheik and Susan Birkenhead.
Wow, how do you find the time?
Well, I've been working on these for a while, so they're at various stages of development.
Lynn Nottage, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.